The story begins with a woman named Maria, who has been married to a man named Richard for 20 years. However, Maria feels dissatisfaction and boredom, leading her to seek pleasure elsewhere, including an affair with a younger man. Additionally, Maria works as a teacher or lecturer, engaging with young people. She can't even divert her attention. Maria lives with her husband in an apartment close to the hotel, where they have been for a long time. Richard often works from home and doesn't hesitate to have his wife wash his clothes. However, in the midst of this, he overhears his phone receiving a message from someone, a child, his mistress, expressing that he can't forget Maria and wants to be with her. What happened last night is truly unforgettable to him. Of course, this disappoints and silences Richard a little. Maria's phone ends up in the washing machine, possibly out of frustration. Interestingly, Richard doesn't react blindly angry. Instead, he calmly asks about the child named Asbrudal. This immediately surprises Maria, who tries to divert attention, but Richard persists in asking for an explanation. Eventually, Maria honestly admits to what she's been doing behind Richard's back after returning from teaching. What's amusing is that Maria remarks that being tired of routine in marriage and seeking excitement outside with other people is normal. In her video, she says this to make herself seem more lovable to Richard. He's clearly deeply disappointed. It seems he's married to someone who doesn't appreciate him. Yet, he never played behind Maria's back. Richard compares Maria to a woman named Irene who once loved him, appearing sad as he mentions that if he had married Irene, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. Of course, Maria refutes this, saying there's no guarantee Irene would have been faithful to him. Richard continues to feel useless, entering the room to calm himself down. Meanwhile, Maria might feel a bit guilty, but she also doesn't want to be fully blamed. That night, Maria decides to leave the apartment and head to the hotel across the street. She chooses to stay there while keeping an eye on Richard. What she sees truly saddens her. She searches for him, but doesn't find him. Though it's hard, she feels she must do this. Maria even manages to fall asleep for a while, but upon waking, she sees a door open, revealing a young Richard lying on the bed, listening to music on an old radio. What does all this mean? Maria feels guilty in her heart and is visited by Richard from the past. Perhaps it's just her imagination, but it seems so real. The young Richard then asks why Maria left him alone, the older Richard looking sad and in need of her. Maria wants to think clearly first. She feels it's unfair to be compared to Irene, even though she's never met her directly. Still, Maria is happy because that night she can be with the young Richard again. She remembers the crazy things they did together in their youth, even replaying some of them that night. Engagement with a strange style indeed. Yes, even though she's older, she can still face the young Richard while they're in their war. The older Richard looks very lonely and sad. A few moments after the war ends, Maria falls asleep and then wakes up, surprised to see a woman sitting in front of her. The woman claims to be Irene, Richard's lover from his youth. Indeed, Irene was Richard's music teacher when he was in school. Initially, Irene didn't take his interest seriously, but over time, she grew fond of him. However, they had to part ways because at that time, Richard was arranged to be married to Maria, whom he hadn't met yet. Irene let him go willingly and wished him the best. It's known that Maria is from a wealthy family, though Richard didn't dwell on that much. They got married, and Irene was never seen again. But now, Irene appears using a time machine and wants to use Maria, whom she sees as having wasted a good person. Irene considers Maria to be a villain, supported by her mother's statement, who suddenly rises from the dead to reveal a list of men Maria has slept with, perhaps around 10 or more. This shocks Irene. She then asks Maria for permission to cross to her apartment. She wants to meet the older Richard and reminisce about their past. They also provide an access code to enter. When they finally meet Richard, he is surprised and immediately recognizes Irene. Her face is still the same as before. How could this be? So Irene admits that she met Maria while feeling sad. Maria tells her she's separated from her husband, but Richard doesn't believe it. He thinks Maria would never say such foolish things. Irene comes there wanting to console Richard. If possible, she wants to be with him again while playing the piano. Irene revives memories between the two. And they even engage in intimacy afterward. As a result, Richard gets a child he couldn't have with Maria, not because he couldn't, but because Maria herself wasn't willing. Meanwhile, Maria, still at the hotel, suddenly encounters the men she had affairs with, all of whom are still young and wild. Richard starts to get angry. It turns out Maria has been collecting quite a number of lovers all this time. Not only that, but the young Richard also gets punched by one of Maria's lovers for being seen as a nuisance, as shown when the older Richard refuses Irene to be his lover again. He still wants to remain faithful to Maria, even though she hurt him. He remains her husband, even though his child, who was previously human, suddenly becomes Irene's puppet. Irene becomes angry and frustrated. How can Richard still love Maria?